In the region of Maon, during the time of King Saul's reign, there lived a man named Nabal. His name meant fool, and he lived up to it in many ways. Nabal was a wealthy landowner who owned extensive property, including vast flocks of sheep and goats. While Nabal had prospered materially, he was known for his harsh and ungenerous nature. His wealth had not tempered his arrogance and miserliness, and he was notorious for his ill temper and greed. He earned the unenviable title, son of Belial, a Hebrew term indicating wickedness, worthlessness, or moral corruption. In short, Nabal was a difficult and unscrupulous man, making him an unpopular figure among his peers and those who knew him. Nabal's wife, Abigail, in stark contrast to her husband, was a woman of extraordinary beauty, wisdom, and grace. Her virtues and reputation stood in stark contrast to Nabal's character, making her a highly respected figure in the community. During this same period, David, who would later become the great King David of Israel, was on the run from King Saul. Accompanied by a band of loyal followers, David was living in the wilderness of Maon. He and his men were fugitives, forced into a nomadic existence due to Saul's persecution. While in this region, David and his followers camped near Nabal's property. To their credit, David and his men did not pillage or harm Nabal's flocks and shepherds. In fact, they provided protection and safeguarded Nabal's assets, particularly during the vulnerable sheep shearing season. After this period, when sheep shearing was complete, David decided to send 10 of his men to Nabal to request provisions. David recognized that Nabal's prosperity had been safeguarded by his band's presence. He decided to request Nabal's assistance with a sense of obligation, reminding him that they had not harmed or taken anything from his possessions. Nabal's response, however, was far from gracious. In a display of arrogance and contempt, Nabal rudely dismissed David's request. He rebuked David's messengers and hurled insults at David and his men. Nabal's response was an affront to decency and courtesy, even in an era marked by rivalries and tribal tensions. Nabal's refusal was a grave insult to David, as well as a direct challenge to the man who would become Israel's greatest king. Nabal not only declined to provide the requested provisions but also questioned David's legitimacy and belittled the servants who came on his behalf. Nabal's response to David's request quickly reached Abigail, his astute and virtuous wife. Abigail was aware of her husband's disposition and reputation for obstinacy, and she knew his behavior had put their household in grave danger. She recognized David's righteous cause and was aware of his growing fame and destiny. Abigail's actions in the subsequent chapters would prove to be wise, courageous, and filled with empathy. In the face of the volatile situation that Nabal had incited, she decided to act swiftly to protect her household, her husband, and her people. As the story unfolds, we witness Abigail's courageous and decisive intervention, a turning point that will eventually avert a crisis and determine the fate of Nabal and his household. Abigail, a woman of wisdom and grace, emerges as the central figure in this biblical account, and her actions will significantly influence the course of history for David and his followers. Upon hearing of Nabal's ill-fated insult and the impending threat that David and his armed men posed, Abigail sprang into action. With haste, she gathered provisions, preparing a substantial gift that included bread, wine, meat, grain, and other essentials. Her quick and decisive response revealed her keen understanding of the dire consequences her husband's arrogance could trigger. While her servants loaded the provisions on donkeys, Abigail mounted a donkey herself and rode out to meet David and his band. Her actions were not just those of a dutiful wife, but of a woman with deep insight and a profound sense of righteousness. She had an acute awareness of David's divine calling and the importance of aligning herself with his cause. As Abigail approached David and his men, who were descending from the mountain to meet her, she demonstrated her diplomatic skills and sound judgment. Her first action was to humbly bow before David. This act of reverence and submission was a gesture of respect and deference, recognizing David as the future king and a divinely appointed leader. In a carefully crafted speech, Abigail appealed to David's honor, wisdom, and divine destiny. She acknowledged his divine calling and the righteousness of his cause. Abigail essentially rebuked her husband and took responsibility for his foolish behavior. Her words demonstrated her own wisdom and her understanding of the situation. David's response to Abigail's intervention was swift and appreciative. He praised Abigail's wisdom and her efforts to prevent bloodshed. He recognized the gravity of the situation that had almost led to an act of vengeance. David, impressed by Abigail's understanding and her role in averting disaster, graciously accepted her gift of provisions. This not only resolved the immediate crisis but also established a positive relationship between David and Abigail. She had, in a real sense, saved her household, and her actions served as a turning point in the unfolding narrative. After his encounter with Abigail, David did not return immediately to Nabal's house. Instead, he allowed Abigail to return to her husband in peace. This respite provided Nabal with an opportunity to understand the gravity of his actions and his narrow escape from the consequences of his folly. When Abigail eventually arrived home, she found her husband feasting and drunk, still unaware of the peril they had narrowly avoided. Abigail wisely chose not to inform him immediately, recognizing that Nabal's heart was merry because of the wine. In the final chapter of this narrative, we learn of Nabal's fate, which occurs shortly after Abigail's return. Scripture tells us that the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. This abrupt and divine intervention underscores the gravity of Nabal's actions and the imminent danger he had placed himself in. The story concludes with David learning of Nabal's death, and he acknowledges the righteous actions of Abigail. Recognizing her as a wise and virtuous woman, David sent messengers to propose marriage to her. Abigail's story transitions from a tale of crisis management to one of divine favor and honor, as she becomes one of David's wives. Thank you for watching this video. Please like the video and subscribe to the channel.